Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and good afternoon. I'm Sang-Jun Lee from ADB. I help leverage Korea's agricultural and rural development experience in ADB projects. Before we start third day, I'd like to quickly recap the very rich discussion yesterday. First, we explored the role of education in reducing rural-urban divide. With the China case, we recognize the importance of human capital for being able to move from middle income to higher income. Human capital can break the vicious cycle of polarization, low production, and stagnation. Therefore, we found the investment in education and early childhood development is very important. If so, how can we close growing education gap between rural and urban areas? As you know, rural areas lack access to public services. We could confirm that connectivity by ICT could help solve this problem. We share the Smart School Alliance approach, which gives access to education service for children in small and remote schools by internet. Second, we discussed the urban farming as a new window for fresh and nutritious food. We explored the Philippine government regulations and multi-sectoral approach to promote urban agriculture. Philippines has administrative order supporting national urban and peri-urban agricultural program. The government has also been tapping government agencies, private sectors, and civil society organizations to work on rooftop gardens and vertical gardening. We also share the cases from India and Nauru. This approach meets the demand for fresh and nutritious food in India and also provides an opportunity for areas with the limited land such as Nauru. We also highlighted the prerequisite for the success of urban farming. For example, it is important to develop light seed varieties for them because current seeds are meant for soil. Third, we discussed the pathways to sustainable and inclusive food systems. We recognize that tackling climate change issue is critical to achieving sustainable and inclusive food systems. Agriculture is a victim as well as a contributor to climate change. We explore the systematic approach to solve these issues. In terms of partnership and advocacy, as the private-public sector partnership, we share the case of ED-led sustainable rice platform and direct seed consortium, which address various problems collectively in the rice sector. Political will also is essential to improve investment in agriculture. In terms of gender equality, we discussed the ways to mainstream women's contribution in realizing sustainable food systems. Main suggestions are securing evidence and data for better policy and decision-making, addressing gender inequalities in access to land tenure, carrying out tailored investment in access to financing for women farmers. With regard to small-scale farmers, almost 85% of land is tilled by smallholders, but only 1.7% of climate finance is towards small-scale agriculture. We found the need to expand the support for them. It was also suggested to create business environment for private sector investment to transform food systems. Finally, just a moment. We saw, finally, we explored intersectoral approach to nutrition security. We saw Asia and Pacific face triple burden, undernutrition, overnutrition, and micronutrient deficiencies. We found we need cross-sectoral approaches based on data and reliable expert analysis to tackle the burden of malnutrition. We explored good examples with the intersectoral approach to nutrition security. Farm-to-school initiatives aims to bring health food to children by connecting schools with the local farms. This initiative embraces food education, Thailand Ministry of Education and Ministry of Interior jointly support this initiative. Rice fortification program was also presented. Multiple sectors such as food, social protection, health, and education system are involved in this program to reduce micronutrient deficiencies in Asia. We also noted the importance of science and technology for nutrition security. For example, nuclear techniques can help to find more evidence on nutrient absorption into the body and also generate diversity in underutilized crops for productivity enhancement. Finally, we explored approaches to nutrient security issues in rural and urban context. We agreed on the need for an in-depth discussion on this topic. That's all from me. I'd like to request Mr. Takeshi Yamano to moderate the next special session. He is a principal economist at Economic Research and Regional Development at ADB. Over to you, Mr. Yamano.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sanjun. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. My name is Takashi. As mentioned, I'm principal economist. Today is day 3 of the forum. I hope you have been enjoying the last 2 days of the sessions as much as I have been. This is a special session on COVID-19. In the past 2 days, COVID-19 has been mentioned in many sessions. The emergence of the digital applications under the pandemic was discussed in first day, linking the consumers and producers and other actors in the food systems. Meanwhile, the pandemic has reminded us once again the importance of access to food, a wide variety of food at any time at low cost. Unfortunately, some people have suffered under the pandemic. Some have lost jobs. Some had to reduce their consumption, including food consumption, on top of the disruptions to our lives and concerns of the health. To understand and discuss more about the pandemic and the government responses in the Asia and the Pacific regions, we have one keynote speaker, and we have 3 panelists. I will introduce them later. But first, let me remind you, if you have any questions, please put your question in the QA box at any time. You don't need to wait until the end. I often forget my questions while listening to speakers. So I recommend you to type in questions when you have, and you can start typing questions now. Okay. So our first speaker is a keynote speaker. He is Mr. Aziz Elbari. Aziz is a senior economist and the stream leader at Agri-Food, Rural Development and Socio-Economic Policies at FAO's regional office for Asia and the Pacific. We are fortunate to have him because he is the lead author of a recently published FAO report titled COVID-19 Pandemic Impacts on Asia and the Pacific. Aziz, you have 15 minutes and I will give you a reminder later, but the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Takashi. Thank you, colleagues from ADB. It's a great honor to be invited to join and to participate in this forum and to share with you some of the findings that we had in a recent study. So let me just start with presentation right away. Okay, so I was asked to give an overview on the COVID-19 impacts on the food systems in Asia. which I'm very happy to give in a very brief format. These are highlights from a recent report that our regional office produced in preparation for the governing body meeting, which FAO just held last week in Bangladesh, where the 43 or 45 member countries from the region deliberated for 4 days at the ministerial level to give guidance to FAO's work plan in the future. And this was one of the highlights of that program. So I will focus on the overview on the effect on the food system. But of course, our analysis was much broader, given that the COVID was all encompassing and cross-cutting and started from the macro all the way to the sectoral level. So I will touch a little bit on the macro just as a way to give a little bit more of a background to get into more detail about the food system impact and the responses, all of course within the time frame of the presentation. So I will be very succinct. You're all familiar with this, so this is the starting point of the pandemic that has and still with us, and we are moving into another phase this year with Omicron and living with COVID. But I want to start with a very brief, for a couple of minutes or so, on the macro impact, which we started off in our report. Obviously, the GDP impact across the region, with few exceptions, was highlighted, but also what brought about the contraction of the economy. The main highlights here is that obviously loss of employment in many sectors, especially in the manufacturing and services sector. That was the first shock to the system, to the economy. We documented the impact at the country level, and we did some sort of a broad, stylized summaries, and we found obviously that the impacts were uneven across region, between urban and rural, because our focus was more on the rural. The urban areas experienced more income loss as a whole, because many sectors basically shut down. Rural areas, on the other hand, were less affected in terms of overall income loss, but more impacted in terms of increased food insecurity and hunger among the rural population. The poverty, of course, was, as mentioned, more pronounced in the urban than the rural, and was evenly, affected unevenly different vulnerable groups within the countries. The multidimensional poverty, which is sort of an aggregate, was reportedly to have doubled in the last 2 years as a result of COVID. We also looked at some more specific or cohort-specific impact, and obviously we looked at the differentiated impact on women, which was more pronounced overall, because women tend to be in sectors and in services that were the first to shut down. So they're like in the informal sector, in the services. Also, women were more impacted by health impact and domestic stress due to shutdown of schools and the consequences of the pandemic we're all familiar with. Another group that was particularly vulnerable to pandemic were the migrants, which are the backbone to much of the agri-food system in many countries. And many migrants were the first to lose jobs, but they also didn't have the social protections that others felt. So there were some disruptions in some value chains and some production cycles in some countries as a result of the shocks to labor. The other impact of this is, of course, the recent phenomena of the reverse migration from urban to rural. Is it temporary? Was it permanent? It remains to be seen, but it added some challenges for the receiving countries, and also, of course, further accentuate the income losses. So this is a little bit on the macro in very brief and syncretic way. And then we move to the more specific highlights of the impact of COVID on the food system. Again, we did a review country by country as far as the evidence could allow us. And then some highlights, basically the urban poor, access to food were very much compromised during the pandemic. This was documented in many surveys by the World Bank, for example. Food demand disruptions were also very much reported on due to market closures, restaurants closure, hotels, and also lack of mobility and restricted mobility also disrupted the normal flow of supply chains, and also the supply, just what wasn't there because the demand wasn't there because many people have lost their jobs. There was food supply shocks, as was mentioned, due to market closures, restrictions, and drop in demand. All of these basically resulted in periodic, locally based, not aggregate and major. So we didn't have the major food crisis that we feared at the beginning of 2020, reminiscent of the 2008-2009 crisis, but there were many documented localized disruptions that had a significant effect on local population and also the local economy. Some of which were reversed as the lockdowns were lifted. The production in general was not as affected on the aggregate because most countries did realize that food is essential, and they allowed exceptions to food-related and agriculture-related activities from the restrictions that were imposed in 2020 and 2021. So as a result, the impact was not as severe or as broad or long-lasting, but there were still many localized disruptions or seasonal disruptions related to labor shortages, input unavailability because of the market malfunctions, and of course, some of the surplus could not be sold. Therefore, there was a lot of reported food losses as a result. But in general, agricultural production on the aggregate, if you look at the whole region and the whole 2 years, was not as much impacted, at least the first year, 2020, a little bit more on 2021, and I'll get to that when I start talking about pricing, food pricing inflation. But of course, we are now currently in a completely different world context because of the recently emerging crisis I will allude to. Distribution and logistics, of course, were part of the disruptions to food supplies. Now, the different subsectors within agriculture were affected differently. Obviously, the staple foods were not as as affected. The perishable food, for example, and the livestock, live animals were more disrupted because of the restrictions of trade and because of all of the added restrictions or inspections due to health, and the fish products because of the inability to go and produce and harvest fish. These sectors actually were more impacted than more staple, storable products. So there was a differentiated impact, if you look at the sector by sector. Turning to food security and nutrition impact in terms of and how the COVID may have impacted these, and as documented by FAO on a periodic basis, looking at a number of indicators of food insecurity and malnutrition. And then, of course, we noticed and we reported an uptake of increased in a negative sense, some of the insecurity and malnutrition indicators. So, for example, the number of undernourished rose from 322 million from 322 to 376 from 2019 to 2020, a 17% increase. we notice more impact in South Asia, more negative impact in South Asia than the rest of the region. And overall, there was an increase of over 3% of prevalence of moderate to severe food insecurity from pre to during the first year of COVID. Turning a little bit to the food price and food inflation story, because it also has an immediate impact on food security and access to food. We observed, of course, that in 2020 there was a moderate inflation, but not a severe one, thanks to a very healthy initial production stocks and production levels just before the COVID at the global level. So the markets were in a healthy starting point, and we didn't see a major shift in inflation. But a year later, in 2021, after a whole year of disruptions and temporary trade restrictions and all the impacts, cumulative impacts on the production, inflation started to grow a little higher in the first half of 2021. And then the second half of the year, another crisis added to the inflation to the worrying level, and that was the energy crisis prices that emerged in Europe due to so high energy prices led many companies that produce fertilizer to shut down. So there was a fertilizer problem, and therefore all of the food item prices went up, except rice, thanks to a bumper production in the region, including in Thailand and others in 2021. But now we are in a completely different world as of a month ago, 2 months ago, because of the conflict in Ukraine. And I'll get to that in a minute. So basically, the inflation is much higher now, obviously. It was already high in 2021, and it aggravated the impact on food insecurity for many vulnerable, poor segments of the society that where the countries mostly continue to struggle with the opening and restricting due to COVID and the different, the different peaks.
3 minutes.
Okay, so basically, just very briefly on some of the replies from that we observed. Reduced consumption was mentioned at the beginning of nutrition food. Many consumers turn to cheaper caloric food. Many reduce the size of consumption and intake of dense food. Urban households reportedly resorted to overeating and consuming. There was a lot of patterns of unhealthy food that was, consumption that was reported as a result of the COVID, and also the increased reliance on online food delivery and e-commerce as a result of the COVID. So I think this is the last one, the last couple of slides, just a little bit on the response. In an aggregate sense, policy responses were quite robust and all over the place, starting with, here I focus only on the responses related to the food system, not the macro responses in terms of stimulus and other measures. But in relation to food system, there were many government moved in to shore up local food production in many countries. Also, some intervene in direct procurement to keep the flow of the supply chain moving. On the trade, luckily there was no major trade restrictions except temporarily, with some restrictions that we reversed. So there was a lot of localized measures focusing on small value chains or local production or urban agriculture. And also we saw an upsurge of interest and investment in digital innovations to shore up the food value chains, which is now becoming more and more digitalized. And the last very important policy impetus was the expansion of social protection measures as a result of the COVID to remedy the negative impact on the vulnerable groups. To conclude, basically just 4 major highlights that we identified in our report that are a core to basically COVID recovery and response. One is, of course, the whole agri-food system transformation that is now a global agenda, as was reflected in the UN Food System Summit last year, basically combining not only recovering from COVID, but ensuring that this recovery is climate compatible or climate resilient, and target improved diets and improved nutrition, while at the same time supporting climate smart practices. The second major area, also in connection with SDGs and the recovery, is the rural revitalization or rural transformation, focusing on employment of the youth, especially those who return from urban and women and rural communities, but also bringing digitalization or digital innovation or revolution to villages and rural communities, which is an ongoing process. And then finally, the expansion of social protection and a social safety net has become a major policy concern or priority for many countries. Existing ones need to be expanded, better targeted, and of course cover those who were not covered initially in order to bring about the social resiliency or socioeconomic resiliency and contribute to the SDG goals on malnutrition, poverty, and hunger. So in very 10 minutes or so, I tried to capture quite just a few highlights from a very rich study, and I encourage you to read the report and then come back to us for feedback. We are doing a follow-up on this now that we are in the post-COVID recovery mode, but also in the Ukraine response mode crisis with all of the major shocks that are expected under the agricultural food, both prices, commodity trade, and the macroeconomic spillover effects that we are observing as a result of this unfortunate crisis. With that, I'll stop here. Thank you very much, and I'll welcome any questions and discussions afterward. Over to you.
Aziz, thank you very much for making a presentation in a short period. I know your report covers a lot more. So maybe in the QA sessions, I hope you can also share more from your study. Thank you for the insightful and stimulative presentation. Now I'd like to invite 3 panelists. Our first panelist is Ms. Yasmin Siddiq. She is Director of Environment, Natural Resource and Agriculture Division of Central and West Asia Department. Her profile is presented on the screen. Okay, Yasmin, so you have about 7 minutes. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Takashi. And thank you to the keynote speaker. Aziz, you provided an excellent backdrop for this session. And for sure, this report that you refer to, I think it provides such a great perspective on what we were observing if I come down to the regional context within ADB. As mentioned by Takashi, I cover the Central and West Asia region, so 10 countries, from Pakistan all the way to Georgia and Armenia, so a very varied region as well. But the points that you raised on vulnerable impacts on vulnerable, the urban-rural divide, drop in demand, distribution of perishables and impacts on supply chains, we saw very much if we drill down into the country perspectives. So what we observed in, and if I zone into our region, were the serious reductions in domestic food supply in terms of availability and limited access to food, even if it was available. So very much observed in countries such as Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and I'm very pleased that we have in the panel a representative from the government of Tajikistan who will share further. Also observed in Uzbekistan. Prices of key staple foodstuffs increased, and in some cases up to 30 to 40%. Again, Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, which are very sensitive to price volatility, that's where we saw some of these major increases. Low household affordability due to losses of earning through losses of jobs and other means of livelihoods. And again, many of the countries in our region, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan as examples, are very reliant on remittances. So with lockdowns, loss of earnings across the globe resulted in that remittance reduction as well. And as you mentioned, Aziz, this resiliency, fiscal and physical reserves, the lack of resiliency against food and non-food supply shocks were really evident in our region. Also, of course, this trade challenges as borders closed, and given that many of our countries are interestingly double landlocked, the closure of borders, particularly some of those key borders such as Kazakhstan, where a lot of the region is reliant on wheat production coming out of Kazakhstan, had its impacts too. Now, I'd like to drill down a little bit further into one of our key recipients of ADB support and financing, which is Pakistan, and it's also one of the largest countries that we cover. COVID-19 impacts in Pakistan. I'm very pleased that Takashi from his department and our team worked jointly on a very comprehensive study which collected primary data. And that's one of the reasons I found the study very exciting, was it was based on household surveys through mobile phones. So about 550 farmers were interviewed through phones in Punjab and Sindh provinces in 2020 and again in 2021 to see what the impacts of COVID were over this time frame. So the surveys found that despite the exemptions of food systems from lockdowns and movement restrictions, food supply chains were disrupted and farmers faced difficulties in selling agricultural products. And again, Aziz links back exactly into what the FAO report mentions, which is that it was the high value perishables like tomatoes and other vegetables and milk products which were really impacted. The two surveys found that COVID-19 pandemic impacts had significant negative implications on farm households in both of the provinces. And about a third of farm households experienced losses in wages and non-farm earnings. About a quarter reported that at least one family member had returned home from urban or other areas. So again, reinforcing that point about the loss of earnings and incomes. So farm households needed further support with the additional family members, but had decreased wages. About 10% of farm households in Punjab and more than half of the farm households in Sindh reported food and non-food expenditure reductions. So again, Aziz ties up with this broader study that you've prepared from FAO. In 2021, the situation had improved in Punjab province, but not so much in Sindh province. And one of the concerns is that the number of the high value crop producers has declined in Sindh province. So those farmers who were cultivating, for example, tomatoes, were probably feeling that risk aspect and did not want to return into that type of production. Just quickly talk about what governments can do. And I'm picking up from your last point, Aziz. I think the social safety nets is a really important piece of work that ADB supported across the region, across actually Asia Pacific. I consider that to be a very important measure as an urgent support that is required to support particularly vulnerable households. But in terms of the site that I cover, that medium longer term development area, then I see that there are two basic areas. And one is encouraging farmers to return to higher value production. How do we do that? I do see that access to credit as a very primary area of support that, and here I talk very much about Pakistan in terms of the study. Access to credit is really quite deficient. And one of the areas we want to look at comes up persistently in many of the surveys that we conduct and many of the areas that we work on, that farmers, while credit can be available through MFIs, how you access it and who gets access to it is really what we need to look at. And that requires cross-sectoral working with our public finance teams as well. Secondly, and importantly, is the provision of basic infrastructure. For a country like Pakistan, 30% post-harvest losses is a huge gap, and a huge effort that could be made to reduce that gap could be through basic infrastructure provision, including improved access to markets, post-harvest support, and appropriate market spaces. So we see these as some of those key areas that we could support from the work that we do in my team to drill a bit deeper. In addition, governments in Pakistan and other countries do need to also look at how movement restrictions and exemption of food systems from restrictions, how they were implemented on the ground. And this could be perhaps one of the next studies that we could encourage Takashi and his team to consider as well. Takashi, I don't know if I'm up on my time, but
yeah, please
let
wrap
me
up.
know. Sure. Just lastly, and touching upon what we're now seeing as one of the emerging, or let's say, the crisis that we're seeing emanating from Europe. Of course, it's also imposing significant pressures across the globe, but again in our region. What we do note from the FAO Food Price Index is how much prices have gone up. 141 points up in February, that's 20.7% above its level the year before. And again, I see that the poorest, the most vulnerable populations, women and children, particularly in the countries that are dependent on food imports, will be heavily impacted. So uncertainty remains about the food exports from Ukraine and Russia. There are increased prices of wheat and maize to a historical high. And we also see that employment and income from migrant workers, again, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan could be impacted. Money transfers will also complicate the situation. So although the food inflation may differ across Asian countries, many countries in Central West Asia, which depend on wheat imports from Russia and Kazakhstan, will be impacted. And Kazakhstan, as a net exporter of wheat, relies on cheaper wheat imports from Russia. Russia's export ban for Kazakhstan could lead to reduced wheat exports from Kazakhstan to those countries in our region which depend on Kazakh wheat. So we see that the situation is rapidly changing, and we're closely monitoring across ADB, jointly with our colleagues in the Economics Research Department, but of course across all of the regions as well, and evolving situation. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much, Takashi, for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Yasmin, for insightful comments. And in the Q&A session, we may come back to you and Aziz. So next, let me invite Mr. Jalil Piruzada. He's the director of Institute of Economy Analysis and Agriculture Development at the Ministry of Agriculture of Tajikistan. The English translation is available. So please look at the bottom and then click on English. And so Mr. Jazil, please.
Я хочу поблагодарить Азиатский банк развития за предоставленную возможность для участия в данном форуме. Затронута очень важная и злободневная проблема региона, а также всего мирового сообщества, так как в последние годы продовольственная безопасность считается очень ключевым вопросом. Влияние на обеспечение продовольствием, отрицательные факторы, которые влияют, год за годом они увеличиваются. Мы наблюдаем различные факторы, которые приводят к тому, что население Республики Средней Азии, а также региона и всего мира страдают от скачков цен на продовольствие и уязвимость продовольственной безопасности все время находится под угрозой. Потому что само сельское хозяйство – это рискованный вид деятельности, мы все знаем. И хочу отметить, что наш институт является одним из ключевых институтов, который разрабатывает программы для Министерства сельского хозяйства, был автором первой программы продовольственной безопасности Республики Таджикистан до 2015 года, потом сейчас была разработана следующая программа до 2024 года по продовольственной безопасности, а также институт был автором программы реформирования сельского хозяйства на период 2012-2020 годы, и сейчас правительство инициировало на разработку новой программы реформирования сельского хозяйства, в которой институт непосредственно участвует, и разрабатывается она на период до 2022 и 2026 годы. Как мы все являемся свидетелями того, что вот, беспросветная пандемия коронавируса в 2020 году охватила практически весь мир и привела к кризису глобальной экономики. Парализовала мировую торговлю, обвалила фондовые рынки и привела к беспрецедентному падению мировых цен на углеводородное сырье и топливо. Большинство стран мира, включая Таджикистан, было вынуждено принять необходимые экстренные меры по предотвращению пандемии коронавируса, снижению экономического ущерба от нее и реализовывать широкий спектр поддержки отраслей и сферы экономики. Однако, несмотря на все предпринятые меры и общие усилия во многих странах мира, в течение 2020 года наблюдалось снижение экономической активности и падение темпов экономического роста. Это касается и Таджикистана, и его основных торговых партнеров. Для предотвращения и снижения негативного воздействия пандемии коронавируса на национальной экономике со стороны правительства было принято ряд существенных мер для поддержки отраслей экономики и сфер деятельности, которые в наибольшей степени пострадали от пандемии коронавируса. Правительством страны был подготовлен план экстренных мероприятий по сдерживанию распространения коронавируса и смягчению его последствий на социально-экономической ситуации в республике, который продолжает реализовываться. Данный план предусматривает поддержку отраслей экономики, особенно частного сектора, сфер торговли и услуги, увеличение объемов производства продукции в отраслях промышленности и сельского хозяйства, привлечение финансовых средств со стороны доноров и поддержку уязвимых слоев населения. В рамках реализации данного плана правительством принято рядом мер по предоставлению налоговых льгот и объявлению налоговых каникул для предприятий и организаций малого и среднего бизнеса, индивидуальных предпринимателей, транспортных предприятий, организаций туризма и других видов услуг. Также в соответствии с указом президента в целях снижения производственных расходов предприятий, предотвращения роста цен на отечественные продукции, платные услуги и роста уровня инфляции, тарифы на электроэнергию, воду, ирригацию, связь и коммунальные услуги до конца 2000 года не повышались. Учитывая, что сегодня многие страны уже сталкиваются с проблемой продовольственного обеспечения и ростом цен на продовольствие, в республике в условиях ограниченности пахотных земель принимались меры по повышению эффективности использования земель, получению нескольких урожаев сельскохозяйственной продукции и наращиванию объемов его производства. В этой связи президент страны провел 2 внеочередных заседания правительства, на которых соответствующим органам было поручено увеличить посев сельскохозяйственных культур, в частности, увеличить до 40% площадь сева под картофели, а также увеличить на 60% площадь повторного сева за счет увеличения площади зерновых и зернобобовых культур. В целом, повторный сев сельскохозяйственных культур был запланирован на уровне около 186 тысяч гектаров. Эти меры внесли определенный вклад в реализацию одной из стратегических целей государства обеспечения продовольственной безопасности. Правительство страны активизировало сотрудничество с международными финансовыми институтами для привлечения дополнительных финансовых средств. В результате переговоров были привлечены средства от Международного валютного фонда в сумме $189,5 миллионов по беспроцентному кредиту, от Евразийского фонда специализации и развития кредит в размере $50 миллионов, Азиатского банка развития грант в размере $122,5 миллионов, от Всемирного банка грант в размере $11,3 миллиона, от Исламского банка развития $9,4 миллиона и от правительства Германии $1 миллион евро. Общая сумма привлеченных средств в 2020 году составила более $384,3 миллиона, что способствовало смягчению уровня влияния негативных факторов на продовольствие нашей республики. Несмотря на предпринятые меры, пандемия коронавируса в мире и в том числе в республике значительное снижение так, перехожу к здоровью. Так. Как и ожидалось, из-за воздействия пандемии коронавируса в наибольшей степени пострадала сфера торговли и услуг из-за введенных карантинных и ограничительных мер на предприятиях и организациях этой отрасли. В частности, объем внутренней торговли с целью за 2020 год сократился по сравнению с предыдущим годом на 6,8%, платные услуги на 2,6%, перевозки пассажиров на 2,5%. Внешний торговый оборот республики за 2020 год вырос по сравнению с предыдущим годом на 0, в том числе объем экспорта увеличился на 9%. Однако импорт поставки в страну сократился на 5,9%. За период 2020 года уровень инфляции на потребительском рынке составил 9,4%, что на 1,4% пункта больше, чем аналогичный период предыдущего года. Уровень инфляции сложился за счет роста цен на продукты питания на 13%. Основными факторами, повлияющими на ускорение инфляции, стали в основном внешние факторы, связанные с пандемией коронавируса, ростом мировых цен на некоторые виды продовольствия, а также ростом цен в странах торговых партнерах республики. Рост цен на продукты питания в 2020 году сложился в основном за счет роста цен на муку на 16%, говядины 6%, растительное масло 42%, сахара 41%, макаронные изделия 30%, яйца 19% и картофеля около 20%. Одним из основных причин роста цен на муку является рост цен на пшеницу и в странах-производителях, поскольку средняя импортная цена одного тонны пшеницы в 2000 составит $243. Я хочу отметить, что обеспечение мукой и продуктами переработки муки в Республике Таджикистан очень сильно зависит от импорта, так как тот объем необходимой продукции мы производить не можем. Мы производим около 800 тысяч тонн пшеницы, что недостаточно. А также хлебопекарное качество нашей пшеницы немножко низковато, и она не способствует выпечке хлеба и хлебобулочных изделий. Поэтому республика ежегодно завозит около 800-900 тысяч тонн пшеницы, а также 300-400 тысяч тонн муки из Казахстана и России. Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you very much. So sorry, I had to hurry you up. But yeah, I'm sure the country like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, as Yasmin mentioned, is in a serious has a serious concerns over the wheat imports. Next, I'd like to invite a panelist from South Asia. He's Dr. PK Josh. He is superannuated as Director of South Asia Office of International Food Policy Research Institute. Okay, Dr. Josh, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Takashi. Thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity, and good morning to everyone. I shall be sharing something from Indian side and the agriculture performance during COVID period and how government responded to various kinds of programs. And then I will briefly cover what we should do in future, way forward. So if you look to the agriculture performance, agriculture was not affected as a result of COVID-19 and subsequent lockdown. In fact, agriculture was the main source of growth of the economy, while other sectors have negative growth. Agriculture performed better as compared to the previous years. It was 3.9 to 4% growth rate during COVID periods. And there was a record production of food grain commodities as well as perishable commodities. So it means that the back-end services were effectively functioning during COVID period and the lockdown, because government has given relaxations for agriculture and agricultural commodities. So back-end services were effectively functioning. For example, seed sector, fertilizer sector, pesticide, the farm machinery and custom hire services were effectively functioning. There was no liquidity constraint among farmers because of the government interventions. As I mentioned, that there was record production, especially for rice and wheat, which Indian government procures for public distribution system. Again, the procurement was record. Government ensured that the rice and wheat which is arriving in the market is fully procured. So there was a record procurement. Also, we built huge buffer stock. In addition to rice and wheat, pulses were also procured during COVID period. But on the other hand, the high value commodities, the perishable commodities, especially the fruits, vegetable, meat, milk, and poultry, and then fishery sector, their supply chains were distorted, and mainly due to lack of transport facilities, lack of storage. Processing was also not there, although the government has given relaxation, but due to apprehensions of COVID-19, the processing sector was also closed. And with this led to low trading in the wholesale market. There was low trading of perishable commodities in the market. Retail prices of these commodities increased, while there was the prices of rice and wheat were unaffected, but the prices of high value commodities increased, and there was also high price volatility. Overall inflation during COVID period was less than 3%. But there was a government response. There was a huge, big program was launched. It was known as Prime Minister's Garib Kalyan Yojana, or the Prime Minister's Welfare Program for the poor people. Lots of programs were given, especially for the farmers. Cash was transferred on the account of the farmers. Cash was also transferred to the poor women's account, and then free gas, cooking gas was given to in the rural areas for poor people. And there was a big program known as Garib Anna Yojana, means the scheme for food. Food was also given free of cost, in addition to the which is given in the public distribution system. So the food was available freely, which was covering around 60% of the Indian population. Cooking gas was also available freely. Cash was available through the PM Kisan scheme, which was a direct cash transfer on the farmer's account. So it was experienced during this period that there was no leakage of the cash transfer, there was low transaction cost, there was immediate delivery of the cash to the households' accounts. So what happened, the free ration, especially rice, wheat, and pulses, it depressed the prices of these commodities in the market, because the households were not going to buy because they are getting free of cost. So this depressed the prices. But now the food prices are rising. Food inflation is rising. Initially, it was due to a rise in the prices of the fuel. Now it is because of the higher input costs, transport costs, labor is getting costly, and also the costly import now which we are experiencing due to the war. Now, what is the way forward? What we have learned and how to move forward? I have six points briefly. One, that we are yet to recover fully. So the social protection schemes which were initiated, I think these should continue for some time, but need gradual withdrawal. This should not be abruptly withdrawal, but there should be a gradual withdrawal so that the household, especially the poor, do not get the brunt of the withdrawal of the scheme. The second, about the direct cash transfer, there were several apprehensions, but during these 2 years, we have experienced that the direct cash transfer program efficiently functioned. Therefore, most of the subsidy programs which are given in kind, these can be transferred to the direct cash transfer. The third is we have also experienced during this period that the institution played very, very important role, especially the cooperatives, farmer producers organizations, contract farming. So we need to strengthen the institutions so that the majority, because majority of the farmers are small and marginal holdings. So role of institutions will play a very, very important role. Fourth is, we have to create enabling environment for the private sector. So for logistics, cold chains, and also for the storage facilities. And we have experienced, a digital revolution during these 2 years. The digital revolution was, significant. E-commerce, e-retailing, e-financing. So I think this further needs to be strengthened in the rural areas. Finally, I would like to emphasize that in view of changing, the climate change, global situation is also changing. Disruptive technologies are getting important. Therefore, agricultural research prioritization needs reorientation. We need a different kind of research. So maybe more research investment and research prioritization would be needed, is necessary for our future of agriculture. With this, I stop here. Thank you very much for giving me this wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Josh. So we have now heard from all speakers. There is one question in the QA box, and I encourage all of you to also ask questions. But let me start with the first question, and that is the rice price. About the rice price. Rice price has been stable so far under the pandemic, and even now. So the increased price of rice will have larger implications in Asia, especially the South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. So let me ask Mr. Aziz. The question is, should we expect a higher rice price in coming seasons? How we should prepare? And then let me add one more question. During the beginning of the pandemic, there was a initial reaction by the government of restricting trade, especially the Vietnam banned export of rice at the beginning, but quickly they reversed. Did the government learn from the last world food crisis on how to maintain the trade open?
Yes, thank you. The exception of rice in terms of the price trends was easily explained by actually a bumper production of rice by Thailand, which is one of the major exporters of rice. So the production of rice was abundant, and as you know, rice trade is relatively marginal. The proportion of rice produced, consumed, that is traded is relatively small, and therefore rice was the exception to the trend of all of the other commodities that saw prices go up. However, now that we have Ukraine crisis and the likely disruptions of exports, but not only of grains, but also of fertilizer from Russia, and also the high energy prices, which are also linked to fertilizer production. We would expect an impact on production. But again, the situation is a little bit difficult to predict, because currently the prices are very high on all commodities. And one thing that perhaps we shouldn't say too much, but farmers currently are happy because the prices are high. But the cost of fertilizer and inputs is also going to the roof. So it's very hard to predict what the next season will be. But all trends are that the prices are gonna keep going up. If the crisis continue, at least for a foreseeable future. The second part of your question, can you remind me of the second part of your question?
About government reactions on the trade bans.
Yes, we looked at the trade. No, obviously, governments still have a fresh memory about what happened in 2007, 2008, when there was a major block on export, and therefore that complicated things. There were some initial attempts at the beginning of the crisis by some countries to restrict exports, to see if that could be advantageous for domestic food security. But as it happened, COVID is a much broader phenomena, and it affects trade in all commodities, not just food, but also medicine, agricultural inputs. So it was all over the place, and any separate measure to restrict trade on one commodity didn't make sense. So very quickly, government realized that those initiatives would not be feasible, and they retracted. So that was the good part. But trade was restricted anyhow, not because of policy measures, because of the restrictions on movements and the transport and all of the chaos that happened. Now we expect more upheaval on the trade because not because of COVID, but because of the Ukraine crisis and the confounding effect on the COVID. Now that we are thinking about recovering and moving beyond COVID, but now this crisis of Ukraine, at least initially on some major global traded commodities, but there will be a spillover effect to input, to fertilizer and other costs of production. There will be change in patterns of production as a result of price incentives that we were going to see in the next season in various parts of the world, including in the West or US or other parts. So it's very hard to see what will happen to rice. But for now, rice seems to be in a good shape production-wise, but it will be hit by the fertilizer crisis if it continues, and it depends on the kind of a substitution to other commodities, which are also going to be impacted one way or another. So we are beginning to monitor the situation and as a trade economist, I'm following the situation on behalf of FAO, but I think everybody else is doing the same thing, and we would like to see how ADB is responding to countries' demands for remedial actions in terms of securing supplies.
Okay, thank you very much, Aziz. So as he mentioned, let me now back to Yasmin about ADB's roles, especially now in Central and West Asia, wheat is important staple. What do you see ADB's roles in that?
Thank you, Takashi and Aziz as well. Thank you for highlighting some of these broad points. Now, again, as I mentioned in the last speaking points that I had, ADB is watching very closely, and I would say we're watching bank-wide, but of course in our region, implications of wheat price increase is far more serious with the larger, as our colleague from Tajikistan government explained, it's really about the price of bread. And I believe one of the speakers yesterday said it as well, it becomes a political issue as well, underlying it, as we see if prices start to increase on staple items such as bread, here comes with it the challenges of political stability. So from ADB's perspective, watching very seriously, very closely, in fact, we're doing what I'm seeing now is maybe weekly updates. And for the benefits of the audience, how we're working on it at the moment is more of this very, very rapid monitoring, pulling together all of the information we have from across the bank. So of course, Takashi, your team, yourself, our country economists, and we have country economists who cover each of the developing member countries that we work with. So we're collecting information from the country level as well. Our regional cooperation colleagues who cover all of the regional context are working then closely with us, and we're working with the central part of ADB's agriculture and food security team. So it's a collaborative effort. At this point, I would say that it's a watch, monitor, and see what type of reaction response is needed. As we're seeing at the moment with the compounded impact, for me, it's really about looking at not just the wheat price, fertilizer price, of course, incredibly important, and the oil price as well, increasing on all fronts, waiting to see what that knock-on effect is on the actual farmer and consumer. I'll stop there,
Okay.
Takashi.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I wish we had more time to talk more about these important issues, but the time is up. So thank you everyone for participating. Before you leave, there is a evaluation questions, I think, which will be on the screen. Yes. So please quickly answer these questions. It takes only less than a minute. We'd appreciate it. So thank you everyone for coming to, thank you all the panelists, and then Aziz for nice presentations and nice comments. Thank you, Mr. Jazir, especially from Tajikistan, and Dr. PK, Josh, thank you, and Yasmin, and thank you very much. See you next time.